there. My name is Dr. Katie Bell, and I received my PhD from the University of Leicester in 2019. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and so you probably recognize my accent. It's not like anybody else on this YouTube channel, but I was drawn to get my master's and my PhD in England because I wanted to study Dickens, and what better place to do that than England? And I'm here today to talk to you about A Christmas Carol, probably Dickens's best known work. Um, so you might be familiar with the film that just came out, The Man Who Invented Christmas. And if you aren't and you're working on A Christmas Carol, I recommend it to give you a little bit of insight into his biography. And while I don't always think it's necessary for a reader to know anything about the author's or the artist's biography to enjoy or to get something out of the work, in Dickens's case, I think it does help. It helps to kind of set a bit of a frame around the piece, and it helps to show you a glimpse into the complicated mind that is Dickens's rather. So I recommend it, and it also, I think, kind of helps to show you that hauntings and being haunted by spirits is an idea that Dickens comes back to again over and over and over. We see it in A Christmas Carol most strongly, and I think he revisits it and perfects it after A Christmas Carol. So before you even crack the novel open, you're going to see the preface which Dickens wrote, which he says, or said, "I have endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea, which shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their house pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it." So before we even get into the story, the plot, we know that this is going to be a book about ghosts, good and bad ones, and the ghosts of ideas, the metaphorical hauntings of one's mind. So the first line of A Christmas Carol reads, "Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that." This is important because it lays the groundwork for the hauntings in the text, the further ones. Because Marley is dead, it is therefore proven to Dickens's readers that what you're about to read is real in the universe of the narrative. It's not an undigested bit of beef, as Scrooge later surmises. The narrator then moves to the "once upon a time" opening, and this is with purpose. It's to transport you into a magical version of our own world where ghosts are visible to those who need to see them. And it's important to pay attention to the contemporary social ideals that are incorporated into the story. Most people, when they come to Dickens, they think everything that he's writing about is in reference to social changes that he wanted to see within his own lifetime. And that's true to a point, but there's a lot more to Dickens and how the different things with which he uses to move his characters. But we do need to look at the social kind of ideals that are incorporated into A Christmas Carol. So when we move into the counting house, Scrooge and Marley's counting house, we see the two portly gentlemen who come in to ask Scrooge to donate to causes benefiting the poor at Christmas time. And Scrooge questions them as to whether or not the social programs established in England at that time are still in operation. Scrooge says, "Are there no prisons? And the union workhouses? Are they still in operation? The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then?" The response from one of the portly gentlemen is, "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." It's important to see that at the time in the conversation between Scrooge and the portly gentleman, they're not really sure if Scrooge is being completely honest with them. They're not sure if maybe he's dancing around giving a donation in an anonymity. So they're kind of taken aback at his sort of matter-of-frankness description. Scrooge goes on to say, "If they'd rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." So this is a direct reference to Thomas Malthus's growth model, which projected that England's population would outgrow its resources by the 21st century, causing the starvation of its people. More than anything, though, it sets the tone for Scrooge's Scrooginess, and his name, later became a pop culture phrase in the 20th century to define someone who was a miser. The Malthusian growth model was proven to be inaccurate, as it imagined England's economy would remain closed, and it didn't take into consideration the ability to raise money from external trade. However, its inclusion in A Christmas Carol points to the idea that the lower classes are a burden which those in positions of power and money have to contend with. They're their burden to deal with. So then we move on to Marley's haunting. Okay, it's the one that Dickens gives the most information to his readers about, because it lays the foundation for the rest of the ghosts in the story to be believable. Now, ghosts have always been associated with Dickens, and this is by no accident. He was keenly interested in the afterlife, and if you're familiar with Doctor Who, he plays twice. He plays a character in Doctor Who, both times in episodes about ghosts. He's also a character in Assassin's Creed. He's a ghost hunting character that helps you play the game. So we associate Dickens with ghosts, and it's largely because of how we've later come to interpret the use of ghosts in A Christmas Carol. So in life, Dickens debunked spirit rappings of the time. And spirit rappings were seances where a medium would call up a ghost or a spirit or an entity, and the ghost would communicate with that medium by answering in rappings yes or no questions. The most famous spirit rappers were the Fox Sisters of New York, who became popular mediums in the 1850s. Their popularity was, of course, after A Christmas Carol was published, but spiritualism was a big pseudoscience of the time. Dickens did not believe in the reality of many of his contemporaries who professed themselves to be these mediums, but he did believe in the afterlife and in the possibility of ghosts contacting the living. We know this because he wrote about his sister-in-law, Mary Hogarth, contacting him through his dreams after her death in 1837, which he was very traumatized by. So we can therefore see that Dickens is making a concerted effort to demonstrate the substance behind Marley's appearance to Scrooge. Dickens lays the groundwork in this story for the hauntings to be real, not just spirit rappings, but indeed real visitations from the great beyond. And so, therefore, Marley and the three spirits of Christmas, past, present, and future, they've got to adhere to certain rules and regulations of ghosts seen at the time in order to be seen as believable. So first, Scrooge sees Marley's face appear to him in the door knocker of his own home. And it's important to note that this is actually Marley's home, and that when Marley died, Scrooge took it over. This is the same kind of lackadaisical, way in which Scrooge deals with death. When Marley dies, he doesn't even bother to paint over Marley's name and their business, because that would take time and money, and he doesn't want to give either of those. So Scrooge has almost kind of absorbed Marley after his death. The knocker on the door is an everyday average one. The narrator makes sense to point that out. It's an everyday average one. There's nothing particular about it. But the narrator tells us that Scrooge had not even given a thought to Marley since his mention earlier that day with the two portly gentlemen. But what Scrooge sees, the door knocker becoming Marley's face, is set to show us, the reader, that this vision really occurred. It was not a figment of an overactive imagination, because if anything, Scrooge's imagination has long since atrophied. The knocker, changed now to Marley's face, had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It's an interesting phrase. This atmosphere which the ghost carries around him or her is a key rule in Dickens's ghostly writings, and it stems from Dickens's understanding of the works of Franz Anton Mesmer, which will become evident as we further examine the appearance of Marley. Before Marley finally appears, Scrooge is attracted to examine his fireplace, which is tiled with illustrations from the Bible, most notably angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds. So first, Marley's face appears to him in the door knocker. He looks again and it's gone. He goes up to his room, he double locks himself in the room, he convinces himself that it's just his imagination, but then he starts to daydream about Marley as he's looking at these sort of angelic tiling around his fireplace. The face of Marley metaphorically haunts Scrooge during this scene while he looks upon the angels, and it implants the possibility for the haunting to occur. Then Scrooge sits back in his chair, he says humbug to all of that, and his thoughts then his eyes inexplicably turn to a disused bell in the corner of the room that used to be a bell for summoning hired help who lived in the attic of the house in days long since past. Scrooge feels a strange, inexplicable dread because he notices that the bell is swinging, first slowly, but then picking up speed and ringing loudly, which is then accompanied by every other bell in the house. It's then that Scrooge hears the heavy clanking chains coming up the staircase. Dickens reuses the idea of bells ringing to denote the arrival of ghosts in two later ghost stories that he writes, if you're interested in ghost stories, The Signal Man and The Haunted House. So bells come back again in that. And bells ringing by themselves were cited as being a way in which spirits would communicate with the living during a Victorian seance. So not only were there spirits rapping, but spirits would ring bells to communicate. So he's incorporating these kind of well-known tropes into the haunting. And it's a manifestation that's associated with Victorian seances and was another way that they make their presence known. So the omniscient narrator, he's omniscient, she is omniscient because not only is he telling us about what's being witnessed, but he's also can see into the minds of the ghosts and the physical characters. The narrator tells us that what Scrooge hears and then tells us what Scrooge saw. Marley's body was transparent. Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the two buttons on the back of his coat. Scrooge felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. Two things are important in this first interaction. Firstly, Marley is an it. He's not a he, he's an it. The narrator twice refers to Marley as it in that introduction, and this is because we, the Victorian reader, are supposed to get the cue from this pronoun that what Scrooge sees before him is no longer human, it's no longer gendered. Before the spiritualist movement took hold, ghosts, demons, monsters, paranormal entities were referred to with the non-gendered pronoun it. Frankenstein's monster is referred to as it throughout the duration of Mary Shelley's novel. That's probably the most famous one I can think of at the moment. But the second thing, besides the non-gendered pronoun, is the wrapper around Marley's head. This is something that most modern-day readers like you and I are going to be confused by, but it was understood at the time to be a symbol for death. The cloth is the bandage is wound around Marley's chin and is tied up in a bow at the top of his head to keep the corpse's mouth from falling open and staying there in rigor mortis. Embalming wasn't invented until the American Civil War, and I can think of very few mourners that would have wanted to view the body of their loved ones with its mouth hanging open. So the death shroud was kind of after coffins became more common. The death shroud was used just around, the wrapper was used just around the neck. Sometimes also a Bible would be stuffed up under the chin to keep the chin closed, but in this instance Marley's walking around, so we see the wrapper, and the witnessing of this wrapper, the seeing of it, the noting of the fabric solidifies that this is indeed the spirit of someone who is dead. And then the two start having this conversation, with Marley doing his best to convince Scrooge that I am really real, I used to be Marley in life and now I am something else. And this is when we see the third ghostly character rule that Dickens adheres to with his creation. So we have the depersonified pronoun, the appearance of the face death wrapper, and then we have infernal atmosphere surrounding the ghost. So Scrooge says that there is something very awful in the specter's having its own air which moved its hair and clothes, although there was no moving air in Scrooge's room. Scrooge notes that the ghost, capital G, sat perfectly motionless, but its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. So, spirits being encased in its own atmosphere, coupled with the previously mentioned odd light which surrounds the face at first when Marley's face comes out of the door knocker, these are direct references to Mesmer's work, Anton Mesmer. So Mesmer, long before the story was written, developed a theory that is later dubbed Mesmerism in the late 18th century. Which say that there is a fluid which connects all things, and that this essence or force functions in a sense like mirrors and light. He wrote, "Its action is exerted at a distance, without the aid of any intermediate body, and it is intensified and reflected by mirrors, just like light." This he dubbed animal magnetism, and he felt that it was like a force field which led to either health or to sickness in the body. So if this force field suffered a blockage, the patient would become ill. And these illnesses were things with which doctors didn't have the answers to, things that were, headaches, things that were dubbed, female hysteria, all of these anxieties, depression, kind of inexplicable things that science didn't have an answer to. Mesmer would try to cure with a version of what was later dubbed hypnotism. So he used this procedure, which we later called hypnotism, to alleviate the patient of these illnesses. So why am I mentioning this? So what you may not know is that despite being an avid writer and reader and caricaturist, Dickens practiced mesmerism. He saw himself as a practitioner of the art of mesmerism. He was well aware of Mesmer's writings, and the description of the spirit's atmosphere and light in A Christmas Carol is not coincidental. Marley is given the most attention of all the ghosts in A Christmas Carol because Dickens has to convince you, the reader, of what you're witnessing. When we understand all these allusions to the 18th and 19th century ghosts, as well as the pseudoscience of mesmerism, we can see how Dickens was utilizing framework to develop his ghostly characters and following a set of rules that he felt were real. So the three other ghosts in this story are the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. Past is presented as being completely non-human. It is a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium. Later, Scrooge sees the ghost shapeshift, first having too many arms and then too few. So really a clear picture of what this spirit looks like is never solidified. Film versions of the text seem to fixate on the child version of this entity to kind of draw you in and make you feel a little bit less scared after the frightening Marley encounter. But the text tells us that it is decidedly non-human and somewhat frightening. The ghost of Christmas Present is also non-human. He's said to be a jolly giant, glorious to see, and he possesses powers beyond those of humans, as he later disapparates right in front of Scrooge's eyes. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come perhaps embodies more modern notions of ghostly figures. When this entity appears, Scrooge could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. Further, this specter, more than any other of its predecessors, has a mysterious presence which filled Scrooge with a solemn dread. It's easy to see how and why films utilize future as looking like the Grim Reaper. All four of these entities follow the literary guidelines for ghosts that have been described previously, but the spirits of A Christmas Carol, what they end up doing is they build a greater framework for what future Dickensian spirits will look like. So A Christmas Carol, in my opinion, is the best introduction to Dickens's works. It combines humor with Dickens's interest in social reform and the afterlife, and what he felt very strong to write about, where he was very driven to write about the ability for a person to change one's own life. We know now that Dickens suffered through a traumatic childhood, riches to rags and then back to riches again, much like his character David Copperfield, but during his life, nobody knew this about him. It was a closely guarded secret that only came out to the world in his biography. Some biographers even surmise that he never even told his wife about his childhood in in the blacking factory. So when we look at A Christmas Carol, we can see that Dickens longed to tell the story of a person who changes his own future, who realizes where he has been wrong and where he has wronged others. It's an understatement to say that change is difficult, but indeed it is. And in this story, without paranormal interventions, we can surmise that Scrooge would never have had the courage to face the wrongs he had committed in life. And it is through their intercession that he was able to shed this hard exterior, which he had developed as a coping mechanism, which I think a lot of us can relate in our own way to. My feeling as someone who studied Dickens for a long time is that Dickens himself realized how hard it is to change and to admit where one has failed. To admit one's wrongs is very difficult. He said at the beginning of the story that he hopes his writing will haunt you and that you'll think of it fondly and use it as the courage that you may need to face your own skeletons hiding away in the closets of your mind.